friends. My name is Stephanie Romero, and I am the founder and executive director of Awaken Pittsburgh. I want to welcome you to our podcast, The Ripple Effect. Awaken Pittsburgh is a nonprofit dedicated to fostering well-being, empathy, and compassion for all by teaching and encouraging mindfulness and meditation practices. I also want to take a moment to let you know that Awaken Pittsburgh offers many other opportunities for practice and connection. For example, you can join our online community, which features a space to more deeply explore the topics we cover with our guests. We have weekly posts to spark thought, practice, and reflection. I hope you will come join us to explore, connect with others, and deepen your practice. You can find out more at awakenpittsburgh.org. I am so excited to have Rick Stachel as our guest today on the Ripple Effect podcast. Rick has been the board president of Awaken Pittsburgh for the past 3 years. He has nearly a lifelong meditation practice with training in transcendental meditation. In his professional life, he is a university professor in healthcare administration and director of the Healthcare Administration program at Gannon University in Erie, PA. Prior to his role in academia, he managed product development research teams in medical device companies. Rick has a doctorate in information systems. His dissertation focused on improving the subjective awareness of COPD patients using a digital tool to improve medication adherence. Since then, he has also conducted research and published articles on digital health solutions for subjective well-being and awareness, as well as product and service innovation. Currently, he is researching the impact of loneliness among college freshmen and how it impacts their retention and persistence in education. Rick, I'm excited to talk to you. I've had the great pleasure of working with you for 3 years now. And and then I read your bio to prepare for this episode, and I really didn't know a lot about your areas of research because we never get to that. So I'm excited. I'm excited to talk to you and just get to know you in a different way today.
Yeah, I'm excited about this too, Stephanie. Just kind of giving everyone a broader perspective and maybe some, some of my own kind of decisions of how I've come to this point.
Yeah, well, that would be great to start with. So I would love for you to tell our listeners just how you came to meditation and mindfulness and the role that it's had in your life.
Sure. And I know that you know this story because I tell it frequently because it is that important to me. I was introduced to meditation at a quite early age. I was probably early teens, and I was introduced to it by my mother. And basically, what had happened was she and my father and me too went on a vacation, and they met a couple from Pittsburgh who were into transcendental meditation. They had been to retreats and things like that, and my parents became friends with this other couple, and subsequent to that, my mom thought it would be a good idea if she and I would take classes together. So that's what we did. We started taking classes, and it was in Squirrel Hill at the time. It was a Transcendental Meditation Center, and I was probably about 13 or 14 or something like that. And at the time we would practice together. So in the evenings after dinner, she and I would sit down and in a darkened room and just meditate together for 20 minutes. And that's how I became introduced to it. And with so many things in life, maintaining a habit and keeping that habit is very difficult. Um, Unfortunately, unless it's a bad habit, right? Those are easier to keep, it seems. But change and making change is very difficult. And so, life gets in the way, raising a family, going to school, getting a job, getting jobs and things like that. I would come back to meditation occasionally here and there. Um, and I think probably about maybe 8 years ago, maybe almost 10 years ago, I started doing it again on a regular basis daily. And I've done that every day, nearly every day. There are some days when things happen, but nearly every day since. And I started it because I was just having a lot of challenges with my job at the time. It was just a lot of pressure. I was being treated well and things like that. It was just, constant work, it seemed. And there was just a lot of pressure. So I even remember I was meditating at work. I would go into an office, I would reserve that space because we were all working in a kind of a public area where no one had their own offices at the time, and I would meditate. And it centered me so much that it just changed my life, really, because, I subsequently left that job because of that. And it was just a lot of pressure. And I realized that I wanted to do something else. And I became aware of what I wanted to do, and that was to become a college professor. So I did that. Um, and it just really kind of changed my whole mental framework, right? And how I think. And I have done reading since and during kind of this period as well, thinking about our thought processes. And it kind of breaks apart the negative thought processes that you might have, or at least makes you aware of those, not only during a meditation session, but outside of that. And it kind of rebuilds connections, neural connections. I'm not a scientist like that, so I can't really speak to it, but um, I really feel that that has happened and that I just have become a more positive individual, more centric, and more aware of what's going on inside my own head in terms of the thoughts that I have.
Well, our topic is awareness, so that was a great little intro into the topic that we're covering this month of August. But before we jump into that, I just want to say I every time you tell the story about you and your mom coming to meditation together, it just makes me so happy because it's such a sweet story. Um, yeah, it's just a really, really lovely story. And what a gift that you were brought to that so young. I found meditation as a middle-aged person, in my early 30s, I guess, coming out of a divorce.
Hmm.
And I just think, gosh, what a wonderful thing to start life,
Yeah.
with something that could ground you.
Yeah, and it was interesting too because my mother wasn't into into it. It wasn't like this is the kind of person she is. She was a very, kind of conservative person, a housewife in the 60s and 70s, So it was really kind of out of character. But I really respect that, and especially now that she's no longer with us, it's something that I have forever.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. And I love that, the way that you frame it is like she's just a normal average person. And that's, I think, part of the myth around meditation that you have to be like, I don't know, hippy dippy,
Right.
Hare Krishna. I don't
Yeah.
know what people believe sometimes that you have to have like a whole life dedicated all day, every day, or
Hmm.
that it can't just be, no, I just have this practice that I
Hmm.
do, like you said, 20 minutes, and it really centers me and helps me be the best person I can be.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I love that. So shifting then to awareness, well, you said two really interesting things. One of them is, building that habit, right? And changing our brains, literally.
Hmm.
And I forget which neuroscientist said this, but there's a neuroscientist. I want to say that, well, I won't say who I think it is because I think I'm going to get it wrong. But what wires together fires together, or what
Hmm.
fires together wires together. So the more you do something, your synapses are firing in a pattern,
Hmm.
right? So the more you repeat it, it
Yeah.
becomes hardwired into the brain,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's the layman's description of what's happening actually in the brain, but they know that this is true,
Hmm.
right? So I always love to hear people talk about a daily regular practice, because if you're sitting and calming your mind, or you're sitting and you're bringing that awareness practice in, then that actually becomes your habit, right?
Yes. Yeah, and that's a wonderful thing about it.
Mhm.
It just, I I hear from a lot of people who are friends or colleagues or just people that we run into at Awaken when we're out in public, and we ask them about if they've ever done mindfulness or meditation. And some people say, yeah, but it's really hard and I can't do it. And um, the whole idea is just trying, right? And be gentle on yourself. And that's hard for me too. Sometimes when I'm in a practice and it's not, you can tell it's not going well. There's just other things you're thinking about. It's okay. It just is what it is, at the time. And there are things in your own body that could be getting in the way, So you just you keep trying. That's all, right? You just get on and keep trying.
Yeah. And I think the beautiful thing about that is every single sit is going to be its own thing.
Hmm.
They're not going to look the same,
Hmm.
right? And by giving yourself permission to have a quote unquote bad sit and just allowing that, you're actually creating the habit of self acceptance.
Hmm. Yeah, which is
Right.
important.
It was really important, right? And knowing your limitations, honoring your state in any moment, like there's so much about that that you could just extrapolate to life,
Hmm.
right? Like noticing when you just can't is even a
Right.
thing,
Yeah.
right? I often tell this story about a time when my husband and I, this was years ago. Fortunately, we haven't had very many of these, but there was one of those giant blowout fights where you were in your mind going, that's it, I'm done, I can't even stand this human being, what did I think of when I married him?
Hmm.
One of those moments. And I think it was the next morning, I was still so like just seething, and I went to sit and meditate, and there was no way I could just be still. It was too churning. So what I ended up doing was I did, I will say, brisk walking meditation in a circle in my,
Hmm.
I have a finished basement, in the basement. And I did that for like a half an hour. And then I just felt so centered by the end of it.
Hmm.
It just worked it all out, right? It
Yeah.
just worked it out. And I saw like, yeah, actually, I was being ridiculous, overreacting, blowing things out of proportion, as we do when we have an argument sometimes.
Right. Exactly. And I think too, you know, uh, it's hard for people to consider what's the difference between meditation and mindfulness. And so a lot of times, I like to swim. I grew up swimming, and even when my mom and I were meditating together, a lot of that was for me to be a little bit calmer when I was in competitive swimming. And so since then, swimming to me has been a mindful activity. I didn't particularly care for it a lot when I was a teenager, primarily because it's kind of, I consider it an antisocial sport. It's not like it's an individual thing, and you're on a team, but you don't really rely on your team members, and your head's in the water all the time. So you're not really talking to people. But now, I just love the rhythmic sense of it all. It's breath work in the water, right? You're just like breathe, breathe, and all you hear is sploosh, sploosh, sploosh. So it's the sounds and the breath work together, and it's just that is mindfulness. So if you can do it 20 minutes, a half an hour, or whatever, it's really centering, and it's not meditation. No.
Yeah, 100%. I also love swimming, and have been a member of the JCC and go there and swim. They have beautiful pools
Yes.
for exercise. I don't get there often enough, but I love doing laps, and it's the same thing. It is breath work,
Mm-hmm.
because if you are not conscious of taking those
Right.
breaths as you're swimming and coordinating breath and body and
Yeah.
mind,
Yeah.
Like you're gonna swallow water.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
You're gonna swallow water. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I agree 100%. And I've even had people that have gone through our courses that have come out saying, I'm a runner and this has changed the way I run,
Mm, mm-hmm.
right? Or I do whatever sport and it's completely changed the way I engage
Mm-hmm.
with my breath, my body in that sport. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's one of the things that's amazing is we have this awareness practice that we do kind of on the cushion, so to speak. But once you develop the skill, you start applying it
Yeah.
and seeing how it shows up in so many other life activities.
Right. Yeah. And that's the beautiful part of it too.
It is, it is. And it also brings us back to that topic of awareness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where your consciousness or your awareness around how you swim has shifted
Mm-hmm.
because of your practice.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if there's like if there's an importance that you see. You did mention the awareness of negative thoughts, and we talked about that
Mm-hmm.
a little bit. But what is that role of awareness in your practice?
Yeah. So I think I did kind of start um, going back to meditation 10 years or so ago because of a lot of negative thoughts, right? And, this is something that everyone deals with. And for me, those negative thoughts were about a lot of things. It was work to begin with first, and then, I had started having sleep difficulties because of work, and then it just started becoming the sleep difficulties because of sleep difficulties. And, my brain is trying to solve a problem. It's like, okay, you're having these difficulties. And what does it do to try to solve that problem? It starts thinking about that again and again and again because it thinks, well, there's a problem and I need to solve it. What, what meditation has taught me to be is aware that something is happening and what I'm thinking, and then just to try to push that aside, right? Therapists often say that, you try to reserve a worry hour or a worry 20 minutes or something like that, so that it's kind of the same concept where you're pushing things just to that particular period, and then you need to walk away from it, right? And you can't worry about there's so many things going on in the world around us. And we'd like to think about them and have an impact, but we can't. There are a lot of things we cannot control, and we can't think about them constantly. Right? So I think that's kind of how it's been important for me, just to kind of realize and become aware of my own thoughts when something's happening, and not to perseverate over something. And okay, so that's happening. I've thought about it. Now push it aside. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I feel you that sometimes, the mind is made to think. That's
mhm,
the job of the mind.
right.
And it's not always under our control what the mind does, but that is the practice of meditation is to notice when the mind has gone in a certain direction and
Yeah.
to have the ability to come back to a different object of attention
Right.
and to kind of honor like, "Hey, I hear you mind. You're going there." And I love what you said about therapists recommending setting aside a time to worry,
Yeah.
because I often, especially for people like teachers or nurses or doctors, where you have to, or, even professors, you're
Hmm.
in front of a group, something comes up in you, you can't deal with it in that
Right.
moment. So you have to kind of say to yourself, I'm going to set this aside and I'm going to come back to it.
Hmm.
Right? So you're aware that something's going on, especially when you work with children, and often often they do something that triggers you because especially I was in middle school for 16 years.
Right.
They will often figure out what pushes those buttons and on
Yes.
a good day go right for it, right?
Right.
Because kids just love to do that. They're just testing those boundaries all the time. And so you really have to be able to just kind of notice what's happening and say, I'm going to come back to that.
Yes. Exactly.
It's so important.
It is very important. Yeah.
Yeah. And creating the space later to come back to it to process is also important.
Right. Just to kind of make a mental note of it and then come
Yeah.
back and then, think about it for a limited time, right? And
Yeah.
because you can't solve it all the time,
Right. Right.
And sometimes it's okay just to say, all right, that happened. Um,
Hmm.
the next time something like that happens, I will be conscious of it and react differently, right?
Yeah, that's I think you're naming there the other thing that's so beautiful about practice is first you get that awareness and then you get some space to choose a response instead of having that immediate reaction,
Yes.
right? And that doesn't happen instantaneously. It happens over time,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is often, especially when we work with teens, what we talk about, right? Do we have our emotions or do our emotions have us?
Mm-hmm.
And for young people, they're still, and I mean, even a lot of adults, we don't have to name any names, but you see them on TV sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
right? They
Yeah.
just,
Emo
your emotions have them, right?
yes. Yeah.
It really, really does. I don't know if you have any experience, like a particular experience where you had a situation where your awareness, right, either transformed how you showed up, if
Mm-hmm.
you have a specific example or how it changed you somehow.
Yeah, so I think this happens probably frequently. So actually something happened to me today. So I'll relate that. And it's a work environment kind of thing. Where um so at the university, there's a team of advisors, I suppose, and they always have exit interviews with students with they when they leave. If they transfer or they're dropping out, unfortunately, or something like that, and they need to know, what happened, not only for the university to try to fix issues that might be happening to other students, but also for the student themselves, right? So that they can follow up with any kind of emotional care or behavioral care that they may need. And so a couple of my students withdrew back in the spring, and I talked to some of them, and they gave me a reason, and they would have exit interviews with the advising team. Well, the advising team sent across information and said, okay, this student's leaving for a certain reason. We had an interview, and I said, well, this isn't the reason I got. And I said, I would like to be part of that interview. I'm their advisor, their faculty advisor, and I'm director of the program. So it's helpful for me. And they kind of gave me this response is like, okay, that's not your job. Kind of stay in your lane. We're going to do our own thing. And so today, our dean or associate dean sends out a list of spring people who left, and 4 people that I know left weren't on there. And, I sent an email back to the associate dean. I said, this list isn't, I know you didn't create this list because you know things that I know went wrong with this list. And she said, no, it was from the advising team. And I said, well, what I wanted to do was go off by email and say, this whole system, it needs to be revised. If I have accreditors that are coming I need to tell them why people are leaving. I need to be, and I step back and I said, yeah, okay, so let's fix the list and we can talk about this at another time. And by that time, which will be in a couple weeks, I hope, I'll be more relaxed, right? And I'll say, look, I'll be more um creative about trying to approach it in a calm fashion, instead of being emotional about it, because I don't think that helps anyone. When you're leading with emotions like that, mine were raw, and they kind of still are, and then people just see you as the issue sometimes, and not necessarily what's going on. So I want to be constructive about it rather than destructive.
Yeah, I love that. And there are so many things in that story where your awareness of your own reactivity and your understanding of what's most helpful in a conversation that might be difficult,
Hmm.
right? Taking care of yourself, taking care
Yeah,
of your emotions so that you can show up as your best self and have a more constructive conversation. Like
right.
that's all about awareness and also the social and emotional regulation skills
Yes.
that we often build through practice.
Yes. Yeah, true. And I also advise students, we have to teach them how to write professional emails, right? Because they're going to go into a work world and, they need to do it appropriately. And it, depending on who they're communicating with, whether it's upstream or downstream. And I always say, don't react by email. If you want to, write something down on a Word document or write it pen and paper and then save it, then come back to it maybe the next day, because now you're going to be looking at it with a different perspective and you're going to be in a better mental framework than when you initially had that reaction. And I think that's practice helps us do that. It helps us give us that space.
Yeah, that's such good advice for young people and for all of
Yeah,
us.
right. I mean, we all
Right.
want to do that, right?
Yes. Yes.
But it's just not
Yeah.
constructive, it's destructive.
No, and I do exactly what you're saying. If there is something that feels upsetting to me and I've received an email, um, I never respond in the moment.
Mm,
Never, never. And depending on how intense it is, it may be a day or two, or it may
mm-hmm,
just be get up, walk to the kitchen,
mm-hmm, right.
get a drink, take a deep breath,
Yes, right.
and then think about it a little bit. Like if it's not a really big deal, but if it's big, I give it time.
Yes,
Yeah, I give it
always
time
helps.
too. You gotta settle. You gotta settle.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's just interesting to me too, like we're so sensitive
Mm-hmm.
as human beings, right? And we also personalize things so much,
Yes.
right?
And that happens, in a lot of situations. You expect probably that to happen more in personal situations and relationships because those are close, right?
Hmm.
Um, but it happens in the work environment as well. I
A
mean, we have
lot.
relationships there too, and you would expect people to be very professional, but we're people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it happens.
Well, that and I mean, especially in jobs where you feel like you're giving of your whole self and you're giving your heart. And I know as an educator and, professors, you're nurturing people,
Yeah.
you're guiding people, you're mentoring people, and you're hearing life stories and
Mm-hmm.
wishes and dreams for people's future. And so you are personally invested in that. So it
Right.
it feels tender,
Yes.
right? When things aren't going well. And so there are just a lot of jobs like that where people it's not just you show up, you make the widget, you
Right.
leave, right?
Yes. Exactly.
And when we have ourselves so personally invested in things, it's hard not to personalize.
It is.
It's hard not.
Yeah.
And like I always love to ask the question like I wonder what's going on with that person.
Yeah, that's very true because you don't know, right?
You don't know.
They're coming into a situation, you're coming into a situation. I took acting classes when I was an undergrad, and I did some, small theater stuff. And they always tell actors when you're coming on stage, you're coming in from something, and you want to bring that with you on the stage, but you don't want to necessarily do that in a personal situation. But that's again hard for us to do, and that's awareness, right? You think I need to be aware of where I was, and this person I'm interacting with may not have been part of that, so I need to kind of separate it. And it's hard, it's difficult to do.
Yeah, it can be very hard. It
Yeah.
can be very hard. That's right. Yeah. I also want to touch on because you're training people to be leaders,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Administrators,
Right.
right?
Yes.
And I would love to hear your thoughts about, the role of these kinds of practices in leadership roles for leaders particularly.
Yeah, I think wow. So I think awareness is so important because we know, and I think the research shows that a lot of people in leave their positions, their jobs because of the leadership. It's not because they don't like the job. It's because they may not like their boss, right? And I think, I've been in conversations in a lot of different organizations where they don't necessarily believe that. It's like it couldn't be me. Um, but to have a leader be aware that something is, going on with them, then and not knocking it down the ladder, right? There was always the cliche of, someone at work yells at you, you yell at your subordinate goes home, yells at their spouse, the spouse gets upset, yells at the kids kick the dog. It's like we have to end that cycle somewhere, right? So it's just uh, having a leader be aware of their own kind of capacity and their strengths and weaknesses is really helpful. And in our leadership classes, we give them kind of a templated approach that's healthcare organizations use to try to understand where they are strong in their leadership skills and where they need improvement in their leadership skills. And that's becoming aware of who you are, right? Because we all bring different skill sets to an environment, and that's why we work in teams, because we all add different things to the team. So to help them understand that is kind of really important, just to understand who they are, what they think are their strengths, and where they might need assistance so that they can, hire the other people who can provide that assistance and nurture them as well, and have and see them as a value.
Yeah, yeah. That's really important. I know in my own transition into a leadership role, um, especially as a founder and an executive director, there was a person very, very early on when I started the nonprofit who gifted me with, and I don't remember the name of it, but one of those surveys that you can
Hmm.
take that gives you all your leadership skills and where
Hmm.
you might need support. And you're going to laugh at this because you know me intimately in this role of leader. They said, you really need help with marketing.
Mm.
That would be the thing on my journey. Marketing would be the thing that I would need the most help with. And it was true,
Hmm.
right? It was true. She did a great job in working with me to do that. And and you also know this, like one of the first things we did at Awaken was try to get the funding together to hire someone to support me in that role.
Yeah.
And it was just that awareness, of myself that was supported through someone helping me see it right early on
Hmm.
that, led to that decision. And I'm really grateful for that
Yeah.
because it's been such a godsend to
Right.
have more support in that area, right?
Yeah. You just reached out and found the person who's doing that, right? And can do
Yeah,
it and likes doing it and is good at
that's right. That's right. That and bookkeeping.
it. Yes. I
I'm
think a
not
lot
a
of people
bookkeeper.
have those same feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I love that you're talking about really helping to support young people embrace not just their strengths, but their weaknesses,
Hmm.
right? To really embrace, not embrace as in I love this, but embrace in like this is my whole self,
Yeah.
right? I have to be aware of my whole self, the good, the bad, the ugly, so that I can be successful and find people that complement
Yeah.
what my weaknesses or not so strong areas are.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
That's really really wonderful way to frame self-awareness in leadership. I think the other thing you said that really hits home to me because I have had bosses like this is, oh no, it couldn't be me, everybody likes me, it would never, I'm not creating a bad environment, like, really a misunderstanding of what yeah, like what subordinates might think or how to create a supportive environment at work, like not being able to be open to that.
Hmm.
It's a hard one.
Yeah, it is. But you hire people for a reason, right? Because they have skills and they're valuable.
Right.
And we just need to give people space to do that. And that's hard. Sometimes, training people and coaching people is a whole job in and of itself, right?
Yes.
And it's like, well, I could do something a lot faster myself. But
Mhm.
that's not sustainable,
That's right.
right? And it's not good for you emotionally, right? So I think, yeah, to be aware of that is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. That's real. Well, I think that we've covered a lot on the business end, but I'm just curious if you have any thinking about mindfulness more holistically, not just awareness, if
Hmm.
there's a role in work life right? And I know you know that at Awaken, we try to start our meetings with just a
Yeah.
moment. Um, we run the organization as a consensus-based organization because we really want to hear from folks and, have worked hard to not just be an organization that does mindfulness, but to be a mindfulness organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I would just love your thoughts on how has that been different? Because I know you work with other orgs. How has
Mm-hmm.
that been different? And not to say that we're getting it perfect, but yeah, like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I've had experience with a lot of different approaches that are kind of similar, right? Right now, I work at a religiously affiliated university. And they start things with a prayer, right? But before the prayer, they always say, "Okay, we want to center ourselves. Let's center ourselves and be present." Um, and then they'll do a short prayer. But it's that piece at the beginning that's really important, and they're saying this is why we're doing this, right? And I've worked at other organizations too where um typically you'll have an agenda and things like that, and so I've had some really good supervisors who've said, okay, we're going to be in this meeting for this amount of time. We need to be present. This is the things that we'll be talking about. Other things might come up, but we want to perhaps put that, well, they would use a parking lot term, right? Put that on the parking lot, and we'll address that some other time. Again, that's kind of the part of the whole practice of, okay, we wanted to focus on this. Other things are coming in, but we can't address that right now, or we'll never finish. And another important thing was that I learned, I took a class in decision making. I guess a training in decision making. And one of the important things I learned was that it's very similar. Once you've made the decision as a team, as an organization, you've made that decision. You're not going to come back and revisit that decision unless, there's other evidence that builds over time. And I always had to remind people too, hey, if you were in this training, remember, we made the decision. We're we're not going to address it right now because we're moving on, right? And that is really hard. People just like want, again, that perseveration on things and talking it over, and people can get on that. And it's all about that awareness, right? And separating yourself from that.
I feel like there's also, I want to say I read some sort of research study or something on different ways of deciding, and some people are really able to just make the decision and be
Hmm.
done, and other people just get caught in that, like, what about this? What about
Yeah.
this? What
Yeah.
about this? Right? It's really hard to end it for
Yes.
some people and just be like, well, we're just
Yes.
gonna do it, and this was the decision.
Right.
So I think you're right. I think that can be, you can get stuck in that
Hmm.
somehow,
Yeah.
for sure.
But I think it's really important, especially in this day and age when we're over connected. It always bothered me. It bothers me as an instructor when I see people on their phones, when I'm trying to do that. And instructors and professors and teachers have different ways of approaching this, right? And in a work situation, a lot of people or supervisors might say, we're going to put our phones away, right? We're not going to deal with this right now. And that's difficult because when I'm lecturing and I see people on the, my reaction is to do an outburst, right? Like, hey, what and that's not the right thing to do in front of other people and things like that. And address it later, perhaps, or call people's attention to something, ask a question. Sometimes I just do a walkabout and I walk down, right? And it kind of changes up the dynamic a little bit. And sometimes I'll sit down next to people in an open chair, right? So that it kind of breaks that and makes it a little bit more equal, right? In terms of, here we are together as a team, we're trying to learn things.
Yeah, the cell phone thing is a tough one.
It is.
And I also know that now young people sometimes are taking notes on their phone,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like I was at a meeting and there was this person with their phone out the whole meeting, and I was like in my mind going, why is this person on their phone the whole time? And then I realized they were taking notes on their phone. I was like, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole distracted society that we live in right now, like it's very hard. And this comes back to the topic of awareness. It's really hard to have awareness just here now with the person that's in front of me,
Yes.
not looking at my phone. Like my husband and I, when we have dinner, we
Hmm.
try hard to
Yes.
put our phones aside, even if it's the first 20 minutes of dinner. And then we're like
Yes.
having this conversation. I'm like, I should Google that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we do the
Right in
same
the
thing.
middle of the
Yep.
conversation. Like, let's Google it. We come
Yep.
up with some question we don't know the answer
Yep.
to. And then the phone's out and then you're done.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
it's really hard.
It
It's
is very
really hard.
difficult. And it's just part of our culture and society these days. It's just everyone's doing it.
Yeah.
And it's almost like an addiction,
It
of
is.
itself,
Oh, it
you
totally,
know?
totally, totally is. They've done so much research, especially with young people, on how it's triggering those dopamine receptors in the
Mm-hmm.
same way addiction does. Like you get a hit when somebody likes
Mm-hmm.
your post. You get a hit when,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Yeah, it totally is. And the other thing that I'm thinking about is, as you're describing your classroom situation, is we also know we really don't multitask.
Right. That's a big myth, right? That
Yep. Yep.
I do a little example in class a lot of times at the beginning, like for introductory students, and I time them, and they're trying to do two tasks at once. And it's a little experiment, and it just shows that when they're focused on one thing, they take a lot shorter time. But when I present two things at once, it's very difficult. And it's like we can't do that, right? People say, "Oh, I'm a multitasker." It's not true, right? And you can't do it.
Well, before we wrap up, I really want to give you just a minute to talk about some of your research because I
Yeah.
think there's been some overlap with
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness, meditation, awareness, and the research. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want to just describe what you studied or
Sure.
are studying and what you found.
Yeah. So I think where it overlaps is when I was doing my doctoral dissertation. And as you know, right, that's a big undertaking, and it takes years to just do the research. And for others who may not know, to get that dissertation, you really should prove something that someone has not shown. And so I looked at subjective well-being, and at the time I was working in an healthcare organization that focused on respiratory issues, and a big focus of ours was adherence, similar to what we were talking about with doing a practice, or just going to the gym and working out. It's a habit, and a lot of times we don't adhere to those things well. Well, when it affects your health, when you're taking or you should be taking medication that you're not, it can be deadly sometimes, right? So, what I focused on was using subjective well-being and doing there was a whole program online. My doctorate is in information systems. So we would use mobile devices or online tools that people could access through the internet. And it would give them over 2 month period, it would give them certain kinds of almost practices, questions that they would answer. And it would say, hey, one week we're doing something about loneliness. And it would give them some background or a video about loneliness. Another one was about positivity. So a lot of the work was about positivity versus negativity because they would initially then get a score, how positive or negative they are. And the research shows, interestingly enough, is that they're not a continuum and they're not opposite ends of a continuum. They're different things, positivity and negativity. And you can be a positive person and still have these negative thoughts and negative things going on. And, so understanding that is kind of difficult sometimes. It doesn't make sense to me, at least. So we were studying subjective well-being with the idea that we were trying to influence them to be more positive. And these were COPD patients, fairly ill people, right? And the idea here was that if you're more positive, the question is, are you more likely to adhere to the recommendations of your physician? And so we did show that we could increase positivity a little bit among the it was about 100 people that I researched over like a 2 month period. And so we did influence their positivity somewhat, but there wasn't a lot of correlation with adherence. And primarily that was because the people that I had to select were already pretty adhered. So, when your life depends on something, you're going to probably take it pretty seriously. Um, so there was, a slight connection with that. Now, since that's been years, almost like 10 years, we've gone on and now focusing on loneliness using kind of the same approach. But I'm looking at college students, primarily freshmen, business school students, and they're coming in and we're trying to determine if you're lonely or if you're more likely to be lonely, are you more likely to leave the university and not follow up on your studies? And we're trying to correlate it with GPA as well, the grade point average. Are you more likely to be more successful if you're outgoing and doing things? And so basically, it's trying to have them understand as well. It gives them a score, a loneliness score, or a connectedness score. And we're telling them, okay, maybe you aren't as connected as other people, and giving them tools to help them do that, right? And that's really a critical age. You're thinking about 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds who have a lot of them left home for the first time, and they have to make friends, a whole new friend group, and be successful. And even thinking about it now, in my days like that, I get anxious about it, right? And it just depends on a person's personality and how outgoing they are and how strong a lot of times they feel in their own identity, and realize that, and then do something about it.
Yeah, and I love everything that you're talking about in your research in some way is based on awareness,
Yes,
raising people's awareness of their positivity or negativity and the
yes,
relationship to their disease,
yes,
raising awareness around their loneliness and
yes,
strategies to help overcome that. So,
yes,
yeah, what a beautiful connection. And it also made me remember that not too long ago, the United States Surgeon General put
yes.
out a statement about the loneliness epidemic in our
Epidemic, yes,
country. And I
right,
think this, like our conversation circling back, and this is related to use of digital devices
yes,
and
yeah,
that it's so isolating.
right. Yeah, and I mean, then you consider you might have friends, social friends that really aren't necessarily connected to you.
Right.
And that is, and I think it's also too, I think, and I noticed this in higher education, we talk about it, that there's a problem with a boy problem. Education has a boy problem in that a lot of young men aren't going to on to school, and that's fine. It's like, okay, well, then what are you doing? A lot of them aren't going into work either. And a lot of them aren't going into trades because, there is a difficult time for employers who do trades to find people. A lot of them are sitting and playing video games, and isolating themselves, which is not helpful for them as individuals or, our collective society, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thing with that 20 something,
Mm-hmm.
early 20s, late teens kind of bridging into adulthood group.
Yeah,
Right. And again, coming back to what we were talking about, addictive behaviors almost.
right. Yeah. And again, you're just getting, those dopamine hits, because hey, I'm winning this game, right? Now, I
Exactly.
understand that. I have things that, that happens to me too, right? But
Right, right.
yeah, I think becoming aware of that is a whole nother.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot. Well, Rick, I would love to ask you to kind of wrap up something that I'm asking everyone on the podcast. If you have a resource that you would love to share with our listeners that has either something you read or know
Mm-hmm.
about that supported your mindfulness practice or
Yeah.
inspired you in some way.
Yeah. So I just picked up something recently. It was a book. And I was actually turned on to the book by you and other people at Awaken, and the author is Thich Nhat Hanh, and it's How to Relax. So I was in this bookstore, and I was taking my grandsons to Washington, D.C. for the summer. And again, another stressful situation, right? And they had a lot of his books there. And when I say book, it's not really a book, it's a resource. It's maybe 81, 90, 100 pages, but on those pages, there's probably 20 or 30 words. And I like just that simpleness of it because it's not something that you have to dedicate your life to, right? You just can pick it up and read 2 pages. And that's a mindful activity in and of itself because that's what he's
Yes.
addressing right throughout and different ways of doing it. And he suggests some was is breath work, right? Some of it isn't. Some was just like, okay, let's just sit and realize our posture, right? Um, and just something that simple is it can be empowering, right? For
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And again, coming back to this idea that mindfulness practice is not some big elaborate thing necessarily. It's actually quite simple and at the same time quite profound.
yes.
Well, I'm glad that you picked it up.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. I love Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yeah.
Love him, love him, love him. Great. Is there anything else that you'd like to share that I didn't ask about? Anything?
I don't think so. I think I really covered a lot of areas of awareness, and it's something that is close to my heart, and I always work on, and will always have to continue to work on. And that's an important lesson, I think.
For all of us,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. It's not one and done
No.
ever, ever, ever. Well, great. Thank you so much for joining the podcast and for all your work with Awaken over these years and yeah, your practice. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie, for the opportunity.
Say Something Studio.